Welcome back. Now, life seems to be more expensive every day. Month after month, we see increases in petrol and food prices with no reprieve. So what are we to do? To discuss this, I'm now joined by financial expert Gerald Mwanyambira, sociological professor Luke Sinwell from the University of Johannesburg, and economist Azar Jammine. Thank you all three so much for your time this evening. We do appreciate it. Perhaps let's start with you, Azar Jammine. We do know that almost every single thing is going up. The cost of living is almost, you just cannot cope anymore. And I'm wondering, with many experts saying that there could be a cost of living crisis. What's your perspective on this?
Certainly, relative to what consumers and individuals have experienced over the last decade or so, what is happening right now is probably a situation where the cost of living is rising faster than they've been accustomed to. But, you know, compared with where we were 20, 30 years ago, the increases in the cost of living are nowhere near as great as they were at that time. The difference, of course, is that the unemployment rate is so much greater now than it was 20, 30 years ago. So those who are not receiving any income at the moment, and there are far more of them now than was the case 20, 30 years ago, are feeling the pinch very much more than was the case a few years ago. And that is the sense in which people say there is a cost of living crisis. But I think it's important to put it into perspective. This is not unique to South Africa. It is a global problem. It is caused by COVID, which resulted in supply shortages in many parts of the world, and that in turn has resulted in a lot of prices escalating sharply. It's been caused by massive fiscal and monetary stimulus by the world's leading countries in the last few years to try and provide relief from COVID-19, and that has resulted in a surge in demand now that COVID is not resulting in too many lockdowns. And thirdly, of course, more recently, it's the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is creating exacerbating shortages of both fuel and food and causing their prices to rise very sharply. In South Africa, yeah.
Continue, you can continue.
So, South Africa can be distinguished from many other countries in the world. We have not had the same amount of stimulus that other countries have had in terms of government pouring money into the economy and causing a surge in demand. That is not the case at all. And in that sense, our inflation crisis is not actually as severe from a purely numerical point of view as it is overseas. For example, the likes of the United States and Europe are now experiencing inflation in excess of 8%. Our official inflation rate is 5.9%. Yes, admittedly, it's going to rise further, but it's still a lot lower than theirs. And so the causes are slightly different from those elsewhere in the world. Businesses are finding it extremely difficult in South Africa to pass on cost increases, which is not the case elsewhere. In the United States, for example, businesses are using the abundance of liquidity created by financial stimulus to pass on cost increases in a big way to consumers.
It's a very worrying picture, and I'm glad you mentioned the fact that this is a global problem, because I was actually told just yesterday that, for example, in Greece, the 1 litre of petrol is nearing €3 just for 1 litre, and that's very worrying. So this seems to be a global problem, of course, exacerbated by a number of aspects. Luke, I want to bring you here in to speak about a factor that Azar spoke about, where he said that, you know, what is the role of government in all of this? Can government try and create further reprieve, for example, what we've seen with the fuel levy, to try and not make things so hard and tough for consumers? What is your view on this, and perhaps any studies that have come out to show whether or not government can support consumers in any kind of way?
Yes, I think the very important thing is that the government does need to intervene, and it is a global problem. But the point is that it's a global problem of neoliberal capitalism. So the World Bank indicates how South Africa is different because we are the most unequal country in the world, according to the most recent inequality report undertaken by the World Bank. So the wealthiest 10% actually controls 80% of household income. We have enough food right now to go around, but actually a quarter of the people still go hungry. So the question is not as much about how much we can produce, but in terms of the distribution of wealth and the distribution of basic needs. And the other thing that the reports that we've done recently on energy racism indicates that people are not affected by these kinds of crises the same way. There is an unequal effect that it has across, and that's dependent significantly upon where you live and also the income that you get. So what a low-income earner in Sun Valley, in Soweto, or in Alexandra pays for their energy and also for the foods that they buy is a much greater percentage of their income. So people have been low-income earners have been experiencing a crisis, and now that crisis is going to be intensified for as long as we have neoliberal market-oriented policies that actually concentrate wealth into the hands of the few and make it difficult for the majority of people to access the things that they need in order to survive. So we can't tell those people who may not have enough food to eat, whose children actually are going to be malnourished, which is about 1 in 4 children or 1 in 5 children, that they must tighten their belt because they could starve. So this is an existing crisis, and it is going to intensify. And the only way that we can respond to that, or that the government should respond, is actually through a mechanism of state distribution of the existing wealth that we have in the country that will enable more people to access a bigger piece of the pie that we have right now.
Gerald, maybe let's bring you in here. And many would say that government needs to do more. Many are saying that the 350 Rand social grant that has been extended is a slap in the face, because if you just look at the price of bread and the price of milk, it barely covers it. And it's very difficult to survive on 350 Rand. We do know it's just a grant and is there for supporting purposes. But many would say that given the rising cost of living, it becomes very difficult for people to accept that 350 Rand. What is your perspective on government's intervention, and if they can do anything more than the 350 social grant that people are currently receiving?
Thank you, Heidi. I think, in terms of the government, they're probably doing as much as they can with limited resources. We have a shrinking tax base because of unemployment and the economy trying to recover from the COVID pandemic. And at the same time, we have a rising cost of living. So, the best the government can do is try to control the effects of imported inflation. And that really sits in terms of things like fuel. And we try and control the conflation, which we can manage here, which is food inflation. And as Luke just pointed out, there's no shortage of food. It's just the distribution which is not being done right. So I think we are going to see a shift in terms of either how people behave and their consumption patterns around food, or we will see change in distribution patterns of that. The part we can't control is the imported inflation, and it does look like the Russia-Ukraine crisis can become prolonged. And as we started, if we're complaining about rising cost of living, if you look at Europe, for example, they're really feeling significant increases in terms of their energy bills and all their food bills as well. The one thing we can worry about in South Africa is things like cooking oil and wheat. Ukraine produces most of the world's vegetable oils, as well as most of the wheat supply for Africa. So we might see significant inflation in terms of bread and cooking oil, but normally consumers do tend to adjust their eating habits. But the bottom line, Heidi, is yes, we are seeing a rising cost of living. The government is doing the best they can, but the only way to mitigate against it is to try and get our economy going quicker and going against the grain compared to the rest of the world, which is probably on the brink of a global recession if things do not change in the next 6 to 12 months.
Azar, maybe we can bring you in here. Is there a risk of a global recession? And I'm wondering if things could get any worse. How worse can things actually get? You know, Gerald spoke about, for example, the price of cooking oil. I mean, this has been trending on social media for weeks now, where people are just saying, how did cooking oil get over 100 Rand? People just cannot believe it. And I'm wondering if, you know, the way you see things as an economist, if things are going to get worse and if we are on the brink of a global recession, given the global factors playing here and how the world at large is feeling the pinch of the cost of living rising.
Unfortunately, there really is indeed a risk of a global recession coming on stream. And the reason is because is multifold. Firstly, inflation around the world is threatening to get out of hand, and central banks around the world who have pumped trillions of dollars into the global financial system to try and rescue it, firstly in the global financial crisis of 2008, more recently in the COVID crisis to try and rescue consumers and give them money willy-nilly, are now having to change direction and having to raise interest rates more steeply than they have done for decades. And that threatens to plunge the world into a global recession. What makes things worse is a lot of the fiscal stimulus and the relief that has been offered by large economies in the last 15 years has resulted in a massive increase in their public debt levels. Funnily enough, to levels well in excess of South Africa's. They haven't felt the pinch thus far because their interest rates have been virtually zero and in some cases even negative. That is changing now. And they are now going to face the same problems that the South African government has been facing for the past decade of dealing with a very high debt servicing burden, which crimps their ability to embark upon still more stimulus to try and prevent the economic downturn that might otherwise take place. From South Africa's point of view, this is a very dangerous development because in the last couple of years, we have been insulated to some extent from the impact of rising prices by the fact that we produce a lot of the commodities whose prices are rising. But should the world start winning the battle against inflation, one could well see commodity prices starting to drop back quite sharply, and that could result in South Africa also suffering. One has to bear in mind that one of the key commodity areas which have seen prices rising more than anywhere else have been your fossil fuel prices. For several years now, the world has been trying to was talking about weaning itself off fossil fuel, and the result has been that very little investment has been going into producing or developing new areas of supply of oil, gas, and coal. And now we're seeing the results of that in terms of shortages of oil, gas, and coal around the world, which are causing those prices to rise at a faster pace than most people imagined. And those too could plunge the world into recession. As for cooking oil, it's important to note that one of the main sources of cooking oil in the world has been the Ukraine because they supply a massive amount of the world's sunflower. And because that has ceased, I heard from my own daughter-in-law yesterday, who happens to be Ukrainian, that the cost of food in Ukraine has now escalated to levels that are comparable with that in Western Europe. And this is causing massive poverty and deprivation in the Ukraine itself. And that was the breadbasket that produced the sunflower oil that went into producing cooking oil. It's not the fault of this is not the fault of the South African government. Where one could be critical of the South African government is the fact that we're talking about providing assistance to the poor, and there's not enough money to do so. And a lot of that is due to the fact that so much of the money that was available to go and help the poor was stolen by those involved in state capture, who claim to be supporting the redistribution of wealth to the poor.
Certainly. I mean, that is another crisis that I think sometimes we aren't dealing with as a country. But Professor Luke, maybe we can speak to you about, as you heard Gerald and Dr. Azaj, I mean, speaking about how we are possibly heading for a global recession, and could this possibly mean that we could see more unrest here in South Africa? What we saw in July last year, yes, there were many factors at play. Many said it was for various different reasons, but a lot of it had to do with the desperation of many people not having to eat, not having anything, and being so desperate, trying to get their hands on whatever possible. Do you think that there could be possible further unrest because of the current situation that South Africans are living in today?
Yes, I think the important thing that our research has demonstrated, focusing on Soweto but with broader implications for the rest of the country, is that the working class is in a perpetual state of crisis. So, of course, we saw that come into fruition in a way in the July riots. From a number of factors, but including some of our participants cited structural inequality. And we suggest that there is actually a slow violence being meted out against people through discriminatory policies that actually have the effect of creating further marginalization from those who are already, amongst those who are already dispossessed under apartheid. So it does seem that the conditions will be, as you push people further and further back against the wall, there is indeed the possibility for further protests, or we could call them riots. But I think for us as a research team at UJ, the important thing would be, what would be the results of those riots? Is it just theft, or will there be positive change, such as further welfare or further state intervention around housing, water, electricity? Will there be more schools that are given more funding in Black working class areas? So we want to see a situation whereby if those riots or protests do take place, there is positive change that results from them.
Gerald, perhaps let's bring you in here. You know, I saw this tweet about 2 days ago where there was the old style of the 20 Rand notes. And it said, when my mother used to send me to the shop down the road to buy bread, milk and acha. And now you can't even buy bread with the 20 Rand note. And it just seems as though South Africans have to find a way to adjust their lives, adjust their expenses, adjust the way they live, because everything keeps going up. But many are saying, to what end? Because many would say, I've cut down on this, I've cut down on that. But if everything keeps rising, the cost of living keeps rising, you know, what more can people actually do to survive?
Look, I think, you know, South Africans have proven themselves to be generally resilient. And I think that even if you look at the food inflation, a lot of people have simply adjusted their diets, the protein intake, the sources have changed. And I think we will end up seeing similar types of behavioral changes around the starch we consume in terms of wheat, and perhaps even substitutes for vegetable oil. Remember, there's an opportunity which arises in such situations. So either farmers are going to start going into sunflower production or alternative vegetable oil sources. The reality is that we will all need to really be resilient, because the cost of living is not affecting one particular group. It's not affecting only the previously disadvantaged groups. It's affecting absolutely everyone. So I think we need to reach a point where government and the private sector find that public private partnership to allow us to, for example, start considering being self-sufficient in some of these foodstuffs, which we have been heavily reliant on the rest of the world. And I think, it's definitely going to be a bit more difficult before it gets better. But I've seen, like in a lot of spaces where people were not growing vegetables, for example, people are starting to grow their own vegetable patch, just so that they can supplement their food income. Because as you are pointing out, the 350 Rand grant is not sufficient, but there's people stepping into those gaps. So all we can hope for is that more entrepreneurs can kind of be created by this crisis which we're living through at the moment. As my erstwhile colleagues have pointed out, it's much worse in Europe and the rest of the world, where they have no food self-sufficiency potential, etc. So I think we will have to have those national conversations now to say, it's not the right time to do the blame game, but how can we change our behavior to accommodate everyone? As Luke pointed out, there is no shortage of food in South Africa, but it's the distribution models which need to be adjusted and looked at. And perhaps as a country, we can come together to solve some of these problems to end up in a better situation in the future.
Certainly. Dr. Azar, maybe just some last remarks from you with regards to what happens moving forward. I know you said we're heading for a global crisis and global recession, which is really bad news because that means things are going to get a whole lot worse. But there's a saying that, the poor just keep getting poor and the rich get richer. But I don't think that's the case in this situation, because if you just see what's happening globally, it seems as though everybody is impacted and the cost of living, every single aspect is just going up.
First of all, I think what Professor Lucas mentioned was, I think, very constructive, that we ought to be looking at our food distribution systems. We are very fortunate in South Africa that we are one of the most self-sufficient countries in the world from a food point of view, theoretically. We've just got to find ways of distributing that food to the poor. There's a lot of wastage that goes around. Secondly, the government needs to get going on its massive infrastructural investment projects that have been announced on a number of occasions. We've been told that there are trillions of rands that have been committed to investment. We are not seeing the outcomes thereof. That is a win-win situation because it could supply jobs to many of those who are unemployed. It would also result in an improvement in service delivery. And the irony is the amount of money involved is really relatively small compared with the amounts that have been stolen through state capture and corruption. That is the real reason why we're in quite the crisis that we're in at the moment.
Professor Luke, maybe just some last words from you. I know you mentioned a lot the issue of Soweto and the energy crisis that's in Soweto and possibly many of the townships, because many of them are subjected to load reduction. And that's also a crisis that is looming, and that also just further exacerbates people's struggles in terms of the cost of living, because they don't have electricity and then they need to, live off paraffin or whatever the case might be. And it just seems as though that is an issue that's also being neglected, that directly falls into the issue of the cost of living.
Yeah, the important thing here is that not everyone is everyone is affected by this crisis. That is, of course, true. But the lower your income, and if you're from a lower class, the greater impact it will have on you when transportation costs increases, food increases, and the cost of energy increases. So basically what that means is that currently the other factor is that in terms of things like debt and people's ability to take on a crisis, you are more fragile. So the lower income places where people are making 2,000, 3,000, you won't be able to take on any kind of shock. And the other factor is that there's been a lot of talk about increased debt also amongst individuals. We know also that the less income that you actually make, the more that you will be paying for your debt, the greater percentage you'll be paying back to the bank.
Okay, great. Thank you all three so much for your insights. We do appreciate it. That was financial expert Gerald Mwandiambira, UJ Professor Luke Sinwell, and economist Dr. Azar Jammine, just speaking to us about the rising cost of living. Absolutely everything is going up, and South Africans just need to hold tight because, as you heard Dr. Azar Jammine saying, we could possibly be heading for a global recession, which could mean things are about to get worse.